Hello, I'm Kate and I like to sculpt. Apparently, considering it has been 6 or so whole months since my last video, but I'll get into that later, I'm not going to stall now. Today I've made the character upon request, Fuegoleon Vermillion from the series Black Clover. Let's get started. You may be a little saddened to hear that I haven't really watched Black Clover. Well, I've gotten to about episode 9 of season 1, out of about 51, may I add. I'm definitely going to revisit it in the future because it does seem really good from what I've seen so far. But I have managed to get myself caught up watching Jujutsu Kaisen, and I don't really like watching 2 things at once. It's too much for my tiny brain to handle. And yes, in these 6 months, 2 new little baby sculptors have joined us, Pickle and Peanut. Very mischievous sisters, but they are reasonably intrigued by what I do. I'm flattered. In the 5 years I have been doing this, I don't think I've ever really made at least a normal man. I mean, I made Ken and Mud from the Gaslight District, but they aren't exactly human, so this was an experience to say the least. And a fun one. And on top of that, I don't think I've even made anything in an anime before, so again, that's something new. At this point I've made the armature using thick and thin metal wire with tinfoil to build up the form, and then I've layered super Sculpey foam on top, not too thick, so I can add more clay to bulk out the form where it needs it, like the calves, hips and thighs. We're going to leave the arms for now until after baking. I've made one of the legs, making the fabric look all nice and fabric-y so that I could do the other leg on camera, as of course I still do kind of need to get back into sculpting because it's been a little bit of a while. Now, to make fabric you need to remember that gravity is a thing, as well as alternate factors like the weather. I know that sounds a bit strange, but things like wind can change how a fabric moves, how fabric moves, and also other things like the form of the leg itself. The top where the thigh is usually will be a little bit flatter than the sides of the legs, as well as the crotch region too. And you pretty much just have to use a bunch of lines and shapes. I use 2 different tools here. One is a silicone tool to make all the textures nice and flat, while the other one, the metal one, is simply just to press the clay into the surface below it so that there's no nasty lines. That bit at the bottom of the knees is where the boots will be, which is why the fabric looks bunched up there. You have to account for what you're going to do in the future. Of course, I wouldn't just detail the whole legs then remove it when I add the boots. When I make fabric, usually I have a sheet that I manipulate and drape using my fingers like capes or ends of dresses, so having to actually manipulate the clay by layering it and adding the curves and creases manually is much different to what I'm used to doing, but I think I'm happy with it. You may notice that I do not add any texture to it, which I know is very unusual for me, however the paint job later will explain the reason for this. Now I'm making the base using some metal wire and tinfoil, and then slapping the hell out of my clay before rolling it out to a nice thickness and adding it on with some clay glue. I use clay glue on the flat side because usually the clay lifts up, but I also use it on the rough side too, just to make sure that the clay has enough stickiness to it so that it doesn't lift up. I'm doing something that I've never really done before for the base, which is wrapping metal wire from the body around the entire base multiple times like this. It's a bit different, but it works. A lot better than any other thing that I have tried before, so I think I'm probably going to use that technique in the future. Now I'm onto the torso, adding clay to make more folds and creases like the trousers, but keeping them towards the middle of the chest. Fuegoleon wears a sort of jacket coat thing, which I will be adding on in a second, meaning if I add clay for folds at the size now, they'll be lost and just end up being a waste of my time. I want to add the edges of the jacket before I make the folds of it, as if I make the folds before, putting the edges on will then make the folds pretty much useless, as I will accidentally smush them out anyways. Onto that jacket, I don't need to make the whole thing as one cohesive piece, just the flaps of it, like at the bottom as I'm doing right now. It has some minor hem details, 3 little lines on each edge, which will be even more accentuated with the painting later on. When working with thin clay you have to be very delicate as to not make it too thin when adding details, otherwise it'll be too delicate and when you lift it up it'll most likely break. I then just add it onto the body and make sure that the flap, the bottom side of it, is not connected to the trousers just by slightly lifting it up with one of my tools, and then I blend it into the body. I did make a bit of a mistake here, which is when adding the little fabric folds, I did add it to the back of the body. It's not a huge mistake, but it is a waste of my time, especially when the cape is going to be completely covering the back of the body. So I guess it is good to plan out what you're going to do in advance, but also you could say that that's also a time waster, so I guess it just depends on what you want to do. I like to plan, but very loosely. At this point, I'm then making his belt. It was quite difficult to get it to fold in a way that looked satisfying, so I ended up folding it a little bit, and then when attaching it to the body I then pressed into the clay like I've done for the trousers and stuff, just to make it look a bit more fluid. Just curious, what's your favourite anime? Let me know. I can't decide whether my favourite is The Disastrous Life of Psyche K or Fuegoleon Beyond Journey's End, which I have yet to see the new season of course, but Season 1 was amazing. Let me know if you want to see anything from either of those, or if you have suggestions on something from another anime. I'm always open to suggestions. At this point, I am going to detail the base. To make these stones, I do it slightly differently to what I usually do. I don't put nearly as much texture in them. It might seem like I am, but I do smooth them out, which means that when I paint them, it gives it sort of that like cel-shaded look without the effort of it, which is what I'm going to be doing on the body. I had lots and lots of these stones, some really big, some really small, and there are some patches like to that right hand corner there which don't have nearly as many. It's just where, say, a path would be leading onto some grass, and then I go in with this tiny little ball tool, scrape in all these details, and then again smoothen them out so that they aren't too harsh. When making feet, I like to think of them as two separate shapes. The tip of the foot is like a little lopsided triangle, and the base of the foot is more of a rectangular shape, which of course I put to work here to make two of the feet, which I then attach to the body. One of them, on the knee that is bent, is pointing slightly inwards compared to the other foot, which is pointing outwards, and then I begin to texture them, also making sure that that bit where the leg goes into the base, I'm going to use that as the heel of the boot. Leather does not have nearly as many creases on it, which is why the only creases here will only be around the ankles. And then the top of the boot has this little flap on top of it, similar to how the bottom of the jacket looks with the 3 yellow lines on them. When I attach it, I put it down flat at first, and then after I have attached it right to the top and smoothed it out and added that crease between the leg and the boot, I then lift it up using one of my tools so that it's not completely connected to the boot itself. To keep what I've done so far nice and secure, I have baked the whole thing. Even though the shirt does look shiny, I can assure you that is just some clay softener. And now I start working on the arms. It takes me a minute to figure out the positioning of them. I put the left arm on top of the right arm, but then I realised I actually want it the other way around. I want the left arm to be just below the right arm so that when it's holding the book it looks more normal, with the right hand being overlapped on top of the left arm. Now I just need to add a few more creases, as you're probably used to by now, and then I need to start working on the hands. In all of my videos, I feel like every time I do hands I go with a different technique, but this time I'm not going to use any armature, like little bits of wire in the hand. I'm just going to wing it with the clay itself. I started off with a lump, cutting it into little pieces, 5 little pieces of course, and then smoothing them and bending them into shape, giving them sort of the little definitions for the joints, and then also putting in the fingernails, which is just little indents to the tips of the fingers. I put that to the side for a moment before working on the book, which is very simple. The way the book really shines is through the paint job later, so this part's kind of boring. I just make 2 little sheets, and then of course the back of the book by using very thin clay, which I cut to the right size and then attach it to the pages. Then using this little blade I kind of cut edges into the pages, which again, when I paint it later on, the paint will seep into the cracks and really define them. Then I need to attach the hands, and without the book on the hands, the position of this one specifically looks very strange, but also kind of gives off the vibe that you would get from animes. Don't quote me on that. Anyways, I then need to detail the arm. Again, with these sort of yellowish details that you see on the edges of the jacket, the boots, that kind of thing. And then once I've added all of that and placed the other hand on, I then bake the whole thing once again so that it's secure before working on the head. Baking it between different sections just helps to secure the piece without running the risk of smushing details. For example, the hands are really delicate and I really can't be bothered to accidentally mess them up. Now I'm working on the head, arguably one of the most difficult parts and nerve-wracking considering the fact that it can pretty much make or break the piece. When making the face, I've kind of given up on layering clay onto it. Instead, I just use the base that I have and then scratch out details and use the clay that's on the face already to make things like the nose and the mouth and the lips. And once I've gotten it to this sort of refined stage, I start trying to make the eyes, and just like the hands, making them even is pretty much impossible. But in the end, after a lot of refining and getting the eyes nice and thin, I finally get it just about right. Luckily, now that it is baked, I do kind of need to pick it up and flip it in weird directions, as you saw while I was doing the eye. That happens a lot, but it's hard to record, so you won't be seeing much of it. The best piece of advice I can give probably when making faces from animes is to use tools that are wide and flat. This is because if you use tools that are thin and pointy, they can usually create a lot of unnecessary texture that gets a lot more difficult to remove, especially when you have things that are kind of scratching into smaller areas like the eyes. Once I've made the face and the collar as well, I then move on to the cape. For this, I use Cosclay Medium. This means that this clay, after it's been baked, can be a bit more flexible. You can touch it, bend it a little bit, and it will not break. As it's quite thin, Cosclay usually would be the best thing to use in this sort of situation, but clay like Super Sculpey can also be used if you don't have any Cosclay. You just need to be a bit more delicate with it. Once I've created lots of folds using my fingers, just gently folding the clay like a piece of fabric, I layer it on, and there's also some extra little bits of fabric like at the front, which layers over the shirt and jacket as well as a bit of the arms too. For that front bit, I don't think I needed to use Cosclay, but it is good to keep it consistent. And then onto something that I have never done before. I have to make a braid out of clay. So I use Cosclay for this, and pretty much I do what you have to do to make a regular braid. There is a cat on my microphone. And bit by bit I have to fold each bit over. If you don't know how to make a braid, it's pretty much you take the middle piece and you fold it left, then the next middle piece fold it right, and then back and forth like that until you've got a nice little braid like that. I didn't need to make it nearly as long as I did, but I wanted to have enough length so that I could control it without it getting too all over the place. There are also little pendants at the end of these little bits. I don't even know if they're supposed to be braids, but that's kind of what it looks like. There's a cat stuff on my microphone. And then I just attach it to the top of the cape here. Then onto the third technique on how to make fabric. So we've done folding it with your fingers, we've done layering up extra clay, and now what we're doing is pressing into the clay to make the little folds, and then as we pick it up we then smush it together and it creates the sort of creases that you see. This is for the collar bit to his cape, whatever it's called. And once we've added that, I then go back to the feet as they are looking a little bit small, and I just enlarge them very slightly. Fuegoleon also has little earrings, which I just grab a tiny bit of clay as well as some just very thin metal wire running through it and attach it to the earlobes. If you have seen my video on the Gaslight District, the way that I do the top of Mel's hair is very similar to the way that I do Fuegoleon's too. I put some clay glue down and then layer some clay on top of it, and then after I've had that kind of almost swim cap look, I then begin to add the details by adding a bunch of little clay lines. It looks a bit strange at first, it's quite defined, but once I've gotten all of them down, and then even the little bits as well, I can then start to blend them in and then texture them too. Bear in mind at this point I have once again baked it so that there's no possibility of me ruining the face, and also it might seem a bit strange to do hair in this way considering the fact that he also has long hair that isn't tied up or anything. So putting that on later might be a bit more difficult, but it ensures at the moment that I can do the top of the hair without any problems. I think a definitive part of Fuegoleon's design is the little quiff of hair that he has at the front. So to make it look defined, I use Cosclay so that it's movable and won't snap. And also I make it separate to the head and attach it later on so I can get all that detail on there without worrying about it being too flimsy and squishy. I then use Cosclay to make the rest of the hair. I use little slabs like these, and then using this tool I kind of carve little lines into them, as well as splitting off some of the ends like this. And once I have a bunch of them in all shapes and sizes, some thin, some thick, some short, some long, some curly, some straight, I'm able to attach them to the head. I start off in layers, of course doing the longest layer first, and then I work up doing the second layer and also the third layer on top of it. I make sure that these strands are long enough so that it connects to the top of the head without making it look too chunky as well, and then I'm able to blend them in and then texture them as well. Similar to the fabric, there are external factors that can determine how the hair moves, however I decided not to try add any, allowing the curled ends of the hair to go in multiple directions without flowing one way in particular. After this, the final step before baking is just to do the edges and then use some clay softener to smooth down the clay just a little bit so it's not too spiky. Cue the cool transition into the painting stage. The first thing we need to do is just paint the base this yellowish brown, making sure to smush all the paint into the crevices. This needs a lot of time to dry as the paint in some areas just isn't completely even and is a little bit thicker, which means that we now have time to paint the book. The exciting part! The most important part of the book is the cover, so we're going to start by painting it a dark red. And then, doing a reverse dry brushing sort of thing, we're going to get a lighter red and blend it just in the centre. I don't make books often, but this seems surprisingly effective for something like this and gives the book almost a vignette around the edges, and once dry, really stands out. In with a much darker red afterwards that is particularly watered down, we then need to wash the edges. This book can't be too pristine. The reason I want the paint to be watered down for this red is so that it can flow easily, not be too chunky, and also so the colour itself is ever so slightly transparent in some areas. The hardest part about the book is painting the pattern on the cover. I use gold and my smallest paintbrush, which is both short and lacking in hairs, meaning I can get just a fraction more control over the paint, especially when the paint is thin. I thought about sketching it out first, but doing it freehand I think gives it a bit more character and gives me more freedom to alter and shrink the design. It isn't one-to-one as the size does limit how much I can do, however I added the main shapes in there, the circular area in the middle, the sides and the four corners, making swirls and small patterns that mimic the actual design as I go. The front cover of the book is marked with a clover, who would have guessed, which also helps me in keeping it consistent with what the front and the back of the book looks like. After it's dried, the gold paint gives it a really good looking shimmer on the details, and now we just have to paint the pages. I don't want to go straight in with a blinding white, so I darken it with just a bit of brown and an earthy sort of yellow. Then, using a wash, which is again a bit more brown and yellowish, I make the edges and gaps between the pages look worn down just a little bit. I can't imagine a book being held by a fire guy is always kept in the perfect condition. It also is a bit biased, since I think books that look even slightly worn down are arguably much cooler than books that look like they just came straight out of a factory. Yellow pages for the win! With that tiny brush again, I'm adding writing to the pages. Of course, this means absolutely nothing and it's just a bunch of nicely lined scribbles. I didn't want it to say anything, as there is nothing of worth I'd be able to fit onto these pages in teeny tiny writing. Oh, and I also don't have a single clue how to write in Japanese. That's probably a good thing to add. Now I'm going back to the base, just using a wash of two different tones. One is a more warm tone and one is a colder tone, just to get into the little cracks and crevices, and while that dries I go back and move on to just adding a undercoat to the skin, just in white. And then back to the base again. After that paint is dried, I'm going to dry brush this nice light yellowish sort of colour, mostly focusing it straight onto the stones but also onto the dirt areas as well. Then with again a small brush, I'm going to push some green into the cracks between the stones, not adding it all over the ground, but I want it to still look like there is some dirt underneath the green. And then once that's done, I will add a little bit of slightly lighter green on top of that, and then another lighter green on top of that as well. It ends up being quite bright, but I think that mimics how it looks in the anime quite nicely as well, so I don't really mind. This is where we get onto what I think is the most interesting part of this whole piece. I finally get to start cell shading. This, if you didn't know, is the type of colouring used in animes and lots of 2D animation, where colours are layered, not blended. Translating this to 3D is difficult, but also very easy, and what I mean by that is choosing the colours and knowing roughly where to layer them is the easy part. Getting the paint to sit where you want, with clean lines and not chunky paint, is a little bit harder, and don't get me started on choosing where the shadows should be precisely. How I managed it is using, per area like the legs, one colour with 3 levels of tone. You start by painting the whole shape with the darkest colour, then you need to choose mostly raised areas to paint the next tone up. Tops of creases are great areas to add highlights, but the second colour is pretty much to add light to anywhere that isn't a shadow, like creases between the legs. The third colour is the highlight. You keep this small and only layered on top of the second colour. You usually wouldn't let it touch the darkest colour, but there are a few exceptions, for example somewhere where the lighting would be extremely harsh, but I don't think that really happens in regards to this piece. My advice on getting your paint smooth and not chunky as you do the layers is to use watered down paint. However, please experiment with your paint and how it reacts to water before doing this. Some crack, mine don't luckily, but if yours do, use paint thinner instead rather than water. Your paint will be more transparent, but that means per tone you just have to layer it a few times before moving on to the next tone. Also, what I learnt from this is that sometimes tiny brushes aren't your best friend. Sure, they are helpful in tight situations, however on larger, more generalised areas you want to be using bigger brushes to get the paint smoother and to avoid chunkiness. Also, literally ignoring what I just said, not every section needs 3 colours. Smaller parts like the boots or the hems of the jacket only really need 2. 3 colours sometimes is just a little too much on the eyes. When scaling up colours, how I personally like to do it is by making the dark colour quite dark. The second colour should then be the accurate colour, the one that the section should actually appear to be in good lighting. The highlight colour I don't like to make too harsh. I like to keep it in close range to the second colour so it doesn't stick out too much like a sore thumb. This isn't me saying that this is the correct way to do it. I see some cell shading where the highlight colour is very close to white and the dark colour very close to black, and it still looks amazing. You just need to experiment and see what works for you. If you look at my hand, you might notice that there is quite a lot of paint on it. This is going to sound really strange, but I almost use my hand as a paint palette sometimes. When using my very thin brush like this, because it has the correct amount of squishiness to it where I can control the amount of paint on the brush, and also skin typically is just a little bit moist, more moist than plastic at least. I'm not saying my skin's moist, but just I feel like skin in general just typically is. So I feel like when using a tiny brush, kind of twirling it on this part of your hand really does help just to get the hairs of the paintbrush to stick together. It's a really weird thing to say. Back to it, I've said this in multiple videos at this point, but very delicate details can be extremely hard to get right when you have shaky hands. My hands are shaky, at the worst of times, when I'm concentrating. How I'm able to stabilise them to create reasonably straight lines is to rest my hand. When your hand is out in the open, floating, it tends to be shakier. It's natural. But when you then rest your hand on, say, a table, the shakiness for the most part stops. The tension releases. To carry this over to painting means we need to stabilise the hand, but in mid-air. And I use the piece itself to do this most of the time. I rest the side of my hand where the pinky is on the piece and then paint by moving my fingers, not my wrist. You might want to move your wrist, not your fingers. It depends on where your shakiness is centred. You can also grab something else like a jar or just anything that is the height you need and place it next to what you're painting to rest your hand on, if you feel like resting it on the thing itself isn't working. Of course, this accounts for fine details. Other things like painting big areas, I don't tend to stabilise my hand as much as I move my wrist a lot too. I can't give you the best advice based on your situation, as reasonably I haven't really gone through it. As I always say, experiment. See what sort of thing helps you. Doing stuff the same way as everyone else isn't always sustainable. Something I really want to add is how the skin looks. I know it looks weird. In the moment, I was painting the darkest colour and I thought, I'm just going to trust the process. And then I had to end up repainting the skin 3 times. And the reason why that sucks is because I want the skin to be as smooth as possible, so instead of painting on top of the old paint job, I had to sand it off every time, and doing that 3 times really took a toll on me because I hate painting skin, and it was taking so long. But I managed to get it to this colour, and it still looks a bit strange, but it'll look better once, say, the eyebrows and the hair are done. Again, now is where you need to trust the process, not before. I really should have just given up after the first coat. But now that we've done that, we can move on to the cape. This is actually really fun for me. I love working on really big areas and doing cell shading on them. That doesn't mean that I don't like working on small areas, they can be so effective, but working on big areas just means that I can be a bit more free, my hand doesn't need to get so tense and it doesn't hurt nearly as much. Although painting underneath the cape was really difficult, I had to whip out one of my biggest brushes, which is just about an inch long, maybe more, but very thin, but just an inch long, so that I had to stick it up behind the legs and around like all the underside of his cape. It was really difficult, but once we got that, we then need to work on the cell shading. The red I had to layer many times. When it was wet, it was very vibrant, but then as soon as it dried, it was just completely transparent. You just couldn't see it, so I had to paint it about like 3 times. Usually I say 3 times, probably about 5 actually. But when doing other things like, say, the legs, you only had to repaint each colour about 2 or 3 times. It was definitely worth it in the end. It looked so effective. The red was so vibrant, but also still quite dull because of the darkest bits between it, so it wasn't standing out way too much. The cape being Cosclay here really did help when painting. I was able to move the clay so that I could paint up under the cape effectively without leaving any visible spots, as well as getting under the hair, as the hair was also made of Cosclay, meaning I can lift that up too. Don't you just love using big brushes packed with paint? They move so smoothly, it's so satisfying. Makes me feel like one of those pro painters that can just paint any line so perfectly. I wish. By the time I had finished painting the main part of the cape, I finally remembered the crimson lion crest on the back of it. I made a tiny to scale drawing first, then used that as a reference for the position and size of it when painting it on. I did actually sketch out the outline first before painting the dark red base, then I just needed to paint the lion and other small details in yellow, as well as the lion's mane being pretty much the same red as the background. I wasn't going to do any black outlines on it initially, but after seeing just how similar the main colour was to the background, I decided to line it in black just to define it a little bit. It was very difficult, especially considering it was hidden slightly underneath the hair too. Metallics, in my opinion, work best when the undercoat for them is black. It makes them shiny and means you don't have to do as many coats to get the effect, especially if the metal is a bit darker, hence why the undercoat here is black. There is also a purple gem in each of these 2 pendants, similar to his barely readable purple eyes, which again I paint using cell shading. I really did have to study multiple references to get the colours and paint job right for the whole piece, as even a slightly altered colour in one section from the original bugs me too much to bear. I love mixing my own paints, which does add to the difficulty, however it's much more rewarding personally. I do see the reason as to why anyone would use pre-mixed paints though. Now I'm working on the hair. I start with a tiny brush just so that I can get his hairline down without accidentally getting any of the paint onto the face where I don't want it. And you might also notice that the squiggly bit in front of his face is also gone. I did cut that off very carefully so that I could paint the face earlier nicely without ruining it and making sure that I can get all the shading correct. But after I've painted the base coat for the hair, I do reattach it carefully, making sure to line the seam up so it's not visible at all. The hair is unsurprisingly a vermilion colour, however can be argued against considering vermilion seems to have a pretty difficult defined proper tone to it, so some look more red and some look more orange like this. The hair is one of those areas that only needs 2 colours considering the raised areas are very tiny and fitting a 3rd colour on there without it looking too much will be almost impossible. I then go in with a tiny little brush and the edges of each hair strand I paint a much lighter orange just so that it stands out as they are all layered up on top of each other, and then I do dry brush the hair instead of cell shading as the lines are just way too small. The finishing touch is to give a matte varnish over the entire paint job. This stops it from being too shiny so the cell shading stands out better as well as all of the tiny details, and also prevents dust from sticking as easily as the paint surface won't be as tacky to the touch. And that is Fuegoleon Vermillion complete. I've been gone for so long for quite a simple reason. I've just been too busy and tired, as well as some other things behind the scenes, but making this has gotten me so back into it and I can't wait to make more stuff. I can't say my uploads will be consistent, but hopefully there won't be a 6-month gap between now and my next video. For everyone that has been patient with me, I want to say thank you so much. It means more to me than anything that you have all waited so long. And of course, a special thanks to the amazing person who asked me to make this. I have you to thank for getting me back into my creative space. I have had time to think, so I have lots of plans. I can't wait to show you them in due time. My next video will be something you haven't really seen from me before, so look out for that. Any book recommendations? Anyways, I do think after making this I need to practice making men, as well as experimenting with making stuff from animes too. Cell shading is just too fun to resist, quite frankly, and I will be watching Black Clover at some point, I promise. Anyways, as always, if you like this video, I would be chuffed to bits if you gave me a little like and subscribe. It helps me out, keeps me motivated, and gives me an idea of the sort of stuff that you want to see in the future. If you like this video, I suggest watching the video on screen now. I'll see you guys sometime soon. Take care. Bye bye!